Hello, my name is Chris Smith, and this lecture, which takes as its topic the roots in urban cultures and immigrant societies of the hip hop complex, is based in work that I did for the 2019 University of Illinois text, Dancing Revolution. As Russell Potter makes clear in this quotation, hip-hop culture, understood as an aesthetic that encompasses dance, texts, technology, music, and visual art, especially graffiti writing, can be understood as, among other things, a heterolect, that is, a set of sophisticated, overlapping symbolic strategies. Hip-hop is deeply rooted in historical processes and in its participants' conscious and intentional responses to those processes. It roughly coincides with the rise of disco in the early 1970s, and it shares many of the same musical influences in the late 60s R&B and funk experiments of Sly Stone, Parliament Funkadelic, and most especially James Brown. It also represents a confluence of musical, oral, literary, political, and technological traditions rooted in urban experience. This particular heterolect originates in black and brown communities' ongoing capacity, particularly in the 5 boroughs of Manhattan in the mid-1970s, to assimilate and indigenize a wide variety of expressive resources. The completion of the Cross-Bronx Expressway in 1963 and the resultant demographic and geographic shifts left New York's South Bronx literally as well as sociologically cut off from the rest of the 5 boroughs. At the same time, a general trend toward urban renewal via the construction of gigantic vertical housing projects further eroded street life and the tax base. Working-class white flight from these borough neighborhoods and the difficulty of finding new tenants fueled a mid-1970s spate of vacancies and arson by landlords who sought to empty decrepit or rent-controlled buildings in order to garner insurance settlements. The tax base further dwindled. By mid-decade, citywide funding cuts further eroded social services, code enforcement, and police presence, while homelessness, poverty, drug addiction, and gang activity flourished. By 1980, for example, over 40% of the Bronx's buildings had been burned or abandoned. Hip-hop thus originated inside a black and brown population largely cut off from middle-class visibility or infrastructure, and with comparatively limited financial and political resources. As with other subaltern musics emerging from urban ghettos in Harlem, Watts, Kingston, the South Side, Havana, Trevay, and so forth, hip-hop's roots reflect the collection of diverse people's cultural and musical experience. Along with New York Latinx street culture, the influence of immigrant Jamaican musical practice is especially significant. That island nation's small record production industry, itself largely confined to the Trenchtown ghetto of Kingston, had by the 1950s developed a rich complex of musical practices based on the influence of earlier Caribbean musics, and very significantly the influence of American R&B, heard on imported 45s and via the powerful signals of radio stations in Memphis, Nashville, New Orleans, Miami, and Brownsville. Because Kingston's urban population did not represent a sufficient market for record sales, powerful producers and record store owners, and often the terms were synonymous, developed mobile stores called sound systems, carried on the chassis of small trucks with powerful public address systems built in. Sound systems could haul product up into the forested hills to find the small villages which were reached by Kingston and stateside radio signals, where drivers would park and blast the latest sides, often hosting impromptu dance parties to boost sales. Eventually, competing sellers began using anonymized dub plates, that is, acetates of bass-heavy rhythm tracks, with the paper labels scratched off to keep other producers from pirating new talent. And then they began to speak and rhyme over these rhythms, and that toasting made stars out of the DJs who practiced it and the selectors, later MCs, who chose and sequenced the tracks. The ambience of this Kingston record business is captured in the watershed quasi-documentary film The Harder They Come from 1972, which borrowed details from the career of a legendary Trenchtown gunman, Vincent Ivanhoe Martin, whose prison escapes, robberies, murders, and mocking letters to police earned the nickname Ragin, in Jamaican patois meaning raging. The soundtrack of the film features the musician Jimmy Cliff in performances of You Can Get It If You Really Want and the title track, whose ferocity mirrors the intensity of his lead character. The soundtrack likewise introduced reggae stars Toots and the Maytals, the Melodians, Desmond Decker, and the Slickers, and Jimmy Cliff himself to international pop audiences. Bob Marley, born in 1945, who later became reggae's most influential ambassador and a figure of liberation on behalf of sufferers worldwide with his band The Wailers, released his first Island Records LP, Catch a Fire, an explicit paean to social revolution, in April of 1973. Early 1970s economic uncertainty and political turmoil in Jamaica would lead many to immigrate overseas to the United States or to England. Bob himself, for example, had spent time in the mid-60s in Delaware, and he left for England after 1976. Jamaican immigrants came to the Bronx as well, and brought both music and musical practices with them. In what might appear a romantic foundation myth, were it not factually accurate, around 1972, a Kingston-born teen, Clive Campbell, who'd been born in 1955 and who'd immigrated with his family to New York in 1967, began to host and DJ for dance parties in the recreation center of his high-rise apartment building at 1520 Sedgwick, which literally overlooked the Cross Bronx Expressway. Campbell, who became known as DJ Kool Herc for his size, strength, and commanding skills on the basketball court, imported the Jamaican art of the sound system and of hosting over R&B, salsa, and funk records. Spinning at parties, Herc also pioneered the art of the break, the sequential repetition on two turntables of the hottest section from two copies of the same vinyl record, which was in itself an extension of the studio sound manipulations pioneered by the Kingston dub producers. The break, a literal interruption and usurpation of a corporate recording's rhythmic language, and its spontaneous recomposition, made it possible to find the most danceable section of a record, and then to extend that break, either by switching between two copies or by switching and cueing between different records with compatible tempi and instrumental sounds. Herc's disciples, most notably the DJ Grandmaster Flash, who was born at Barbados in 1958, and Africa Bambaataa, born in the Bronx in 1957, further extended these turntable techniques, pioneering a whole series of physical manipulations, turning needle scratchings, abrupt crossfades, manual retards or accelerations into a complex and potent sonic palette. DJs therefore essentially invented a new set of sonic possibilities, one which was, because based in part upon recutting quoted material and played with the dynamics of familiarity versus unfamiliarity, uniquely reflected the signifying semiotics identified by Henry Louis Gates. Herc, Flash, Bambaataa, and their disciples were legendary not only for their physical dexterity on the turntables, but also for their encyclopedic knowledge of recorded music of many genres, and for their sophisticated ability to read a crowd and spin so as to maximize the desire to dance. MCs, the masters of ceremonies whose adaptations of Jamaican toasting and North American radio jocks vocalizing gave hip-hop its lyrical core, likewise built a rhetorical vocabulary out of the community's own street patois and traditions of verbal art. See, for example, the venerable rhyming poetry of The Dozens. But it was not until 1982's The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five that hip-hop was widely and commercially seen as directly addressing considerations of inner-city history and social dynamics, as in a previous era had R&B singers like Sam Cooke with The Change Is Gonna Come and Marvin Gaye, What's Going On. In the 1970s, hip-hop's political address was therefore not originally textual, that is, it was not based in words spoken explicitly to power, but rather sonic and spatial. Nevertheless, as Trisha Rose says, quote, to dismiss rappers who do not choose political subjects as having no politically resistive roles ignores the complex web of institutional policing to which all rappers are subjected, especially in large public space contexts, end quote. For early hip-hop, then, speech, sound, and movement to occupy physical, sonic, and cognitive space as an oppositional heterolect was therefore intended to resist. That resistance could take many forms, some more explicitly political, and others less. A complex interplay also exists between hip-hop's musical roots, its sociocultural contextual specifics, and its movement languages. Like jazz in New Orleans and Kansas City, reggae in Kingston, calypso in Port of Spain, electric blues in Chicago, and in many other settings, the stark realities of urban working-class existence, including variously unemployment, crime, drug addiction, and youth gang activity, influenced hip-hop aesthetic politics as well as its musical inspirations did. For example, long before the rise of West Coast gangster rap, whose explosive topics, texts, and visual rhetoric modernized the Rygin, staggeringly legendary Bad Man to target late capitalism, hip-hop DJs found audiences, dancers, converts, and crews among the ranks of Black and Latino youth gangs. Just as exchange between Black and Latino musics yielded the disco and funk that Herc and his followers spun, interplay between gangs fueled the hip-hop movement revolution. Several gang leaders, most notably Bambaataa himself, born Kevin Donovan in the Bronx River Projects in 1957, recognized the expressive and community-building capacities of nascent hip-hop. A noted DJ in the Herc mold, by 1973, Bambaataa had transformed his Black Spade street gang into a loose creative collective called the Universal Zulu Nation. Hip-hop was crucial to the burgeoning sense of the subaltern community's dance identity. Chang, for example, provides a powerful description of particular gangs' identifications with particular songs. Quote, "At the climax of a Plaza Tunnel night, when DJ John Brown put on James Brown's funk anthem Soul Power, black spades would overrun the floor hollering, 'Spade Power,'" end quote. That empowered community identity, tied directly to the performance of group unity via music and movement, is at the core of hip-hop's spatial strategies. Along with certain iconic Latin recordings, most notably the incredible bongo band's Apache, the work of James Brown was again a particularly potent influence. 1969's Funky Drummer, for example, featuring a drum break by Clyde Stubblefield, was only one of dozens of JB tunes at the center of the DJ's arsenal. But James was influential as an icon of black self-sufficiency as well. In addition to managing his own recordings and tours, he released a series of musically innovative singles at the end of the decade whose titles themselves are a paean to post-civil rights community identity. Say It Loud, I'm Black, I'm Proud, I Don't Want Nobody to Give Me Nothing, Open Up the Door, I'll Get It Myself, Brother Rap, and Get Up, Get Into It, Get Involved, Hey America, King Hebron, and a number of others. An additional factor shaping certain elements of nascent hip-hop consciousness, one which has been somewhat under-theorized, is the continuity between elements of hip-hop's political perspectives and longer threads of historical awareness inherited from the 1960s. The Black Panther Party, for example, founded in Oakland in 1966 as a community-based empowerment movement, had built on the archetypes of earlier self-help organizations, most notably Elijah Muhammad's Black Muslims and Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, and yoked to a sophisticated understanding of television-age semiotics. By mid-1968, the Panthers' paramilitary uniforms, dark glasses, legal display of firearms, and combative rhetoric had made them iconic in both black working-class and white liberal consciousness, and also had made them a principal target for the FBI's notorious COINTELPRO program of intimidation, entrapment, and propaganda. Though far less widely reported, their activities within the black community, emphasizing neighborhood self-help, work with prison inmates, and drug and alcohol programs, provided ongoing models for African-American young people's developing political consciousness. The Panthers link up with Latinx and working-class white groups, that is, their modernization of the community-based self-help programs modeled by Marcus Garvey, and before that, by social organizations like Haitian Rara groups and New Orleans Mardi Gras Indians, provided another model for hip-hop artists' shift from street crime to creative politics. Finally, just as Hollywood gangster films and westerns had been a favorite of Kingston Rude Boys and had played a role in creating the myth of Rajan Ivanhoe Martin and the filmic language of The Harder They Come, early 1970s American New Wave cinema provided theatricalized models for the urban anti-heroes who helped shape nationalist consciousness in the early hip-hop world. In this era, African-American filmmakers, many of them actors previously denied the opportunity to direct or produce, developed their own properties and funding. Most influentially, in 1971, the actor Melvin Van Peebles shot Sweet Sweetback's badass song, A Chase movie, in only 19 days, as an independent production, both directing and playing the title character. Featuring a score by the then-unknown Earth, Wind & Fire, its soundtrack was actually released for fundraising purposes in advance of the film's premiere in April of 1971. Though highly controversial because it includes several unsimulated sex scenes, and because the anti-hero title character, having assaulted a pair of brutal cops, eventually escapes to Mexico, Sweet Sweetback was extremely popular in the black community. And partly because Sweetback depicts one sympathetic character as a Black Panther, it was also regarded as essential viewing for members of the Black Panther Party itself. Indeed, Minister Huey P. Newton dedicated an entire essay to Sweetback, while Stephen Holden identifies a, quote, explicitly political anger that boils through the entire blaxploitation film genre, end quote. All of these archetypes, youth gangs and James Brown, Jamaican toasting and Latin dance grooves, the Black Panthers and blaxploitation, became grist to hip-hop's syncretic reimagination of black nationalism. Hip-hop's oppositional stance was already politically transgressive before it was ever politically explicit. And again, as with the Mardi Gras Indians and the social clubs of New Orleans, or the Escolas do Samba of Rio, and many other urban neighborhood self-help groups, that stance literally embodied resistance by virtue of its contestation of dominant culture's control of the streets. Tricia Rose, for example, a noted theorist, sees these tactics as, quote, a blueprint for social resistance, as a way of learning to exploit social rupture, the cracks which Deserto describes that, quote, open in the surveillance of the proprietary powers, end quote. And out of that opposition, and a few borrowed tracks, a couple of turntables, and the human body on the street corner, it became possible to forge a uniquely syncretic subaltern identity. So where does street dance fit into these cultural landscapes? Scholars of the hip-hop complex have provided clues, which can inform our understanding not only of hip-hop, but of all the dance rebellions discussed throughout this course. Fraser and Koslow, for example, suggest that, quote, street dancers embody space. They give expression to their identities, and they make visible counter-arguments about how space should be used and who can use it, end quote. Historically, these arguments were sounded and embodied, that is, they were made visible, rather than articulated in prose. But they were no less eloquent for the absence of such expository prose. And so here, perhaps a personal and historical anecdote becomes relevant and resonant. In 1977, I was a student in the inaugural freshman year undergraduate program offered by the New School for Social Research. Housing its small initial cadre of 20 to 25 students in NYU dorms on East 10th Street in Lower Manhattan, the FYP held its seminars at the New School's main campus at 66 West 12th. As part of my activities that year, I assisted a program colleague as a volunteer teaching literacy at a school in East Harlem 2 days a week after my own classes. We'd ride the number 6 line north from 14th Street and walk from 125th Street east to the primary school. So I thus first heard hip-hop, which at that time was several years away from LP recordings, much less visibility on television, in the context of East Harlem playgrounds. MCs toasting, DJs wiring their salvaged turntables and amplifiers into the light posts on basketball courts. Though my musical taste and experience were both narrow and directed elsewhere, as an instrumentalist, even at the age of 17, I was immediately and lastingly struck by the sheer digital mastery of those turntable DJs. Now, this autobiographical experience, which long predates my scholarly engagement with street dance and hip-hop culture, after all, in 1977 the term itself barely existed, suggests that the immediacy with which this form of expression could occupy and thus temporarily claim public spaces was powerful. In a social and physical geography, that is New York's 5 boroughs, and more specifically the South Bronx, in which working-class black and brown youth were largely isolated from wider cultural currents and certainly from economic opportunity, the continued capacity to create art was an essential identity tool. Guthrie Ramsey theorizes the urban landscape as a series of, quote, community theaters, public spaces that provide audiences with a place to negotiate with others in a highly social way what cultural expressions such as music mean. End quote. The use of sonic and visual noise, the archetypal oversized cassette-playing boomboxes that b-boys or break boys shouldered on the New York subways, and their dances that took over playgrounds, sidewalks, and vacant lots were equally essential and theatrical strategies of resistance. Movement itself, especially improvisational motion, resisted authoritarian construction of space. So b-boying, the complex of dance vocabularies that developed as part of hip-hop culture, parallel with and complementary to its lyrical, sonic, and technological innovations, may be understood to be an essential component of the community's expressive arsenal, its heterolect, like emceeing, rhyming poetry, DJing, creating beats for dancers and MCs, and graffiti writing. B-boying is a competitive, improvisational, and deeply personalized oral tradition art form that depends upon both individual choice, awareness of traditional practices and watershed innovators, and community recognition and approval. Its archetypal venue is the cipher, a circle of participant observers reminiscent of the ring shout, the kalinda, the capoeira players' circle, which is another possible influence on hip-hop, but also of Mardi Gras Indian practice rings and a range of other Afro-Caribbean performance sites. B-boys are eloquent and articulate about what goes on within this sacred space. Quote, it happens in an exchange. He's giving me something I can relate to, and I have to answer with something that he can relate to, so we can continue this battle, end quote. Improvisation, in other words, fuels innovation, as dancers constantly seek and develop new moves and responses to different music and to competition. This innovation and personalization of dance style is accelerated because b-boying places such a high premium on live performance. Dancers may develop and fine-tune new moves in practice, but the selection, combination, and sequencing of that vocabulary in the real-time act of performance represents, just like bebop or the blues, spontaneous kinesthetic conversation. That performance occurs and is assessed in the midst of an audience of actively engaged peers. Quote, at the core of hip-hop is the notion of something called the cipher. Partly for competition and partly for community, the cipher is the circle of participants and onlookers that closes around battling rappers or dancers as they improvise for each other. If you have the guts to step into the cipher and tell your story, and above all, demonstrate your uniqueness, you might be accepted into the community." End quote. It's important to add here that the cipher, like the ring shout, the kalinda, and the many other circular dances mentioned previously, is portable. It can be created within seconds, anywhere within public or private space. So, for example, given the particularly light footprint of early hip-hop, whose rhyming and dancing could happen in the absence of almost any technology, and whose only supporting technology, a boombox or perhaps a couple of salvaged turntables, was likewise portable. It therefore seems essential to understand dance as a central part of hip-hop's reclamation of public space. The precision and integration of Sally Baines' description of b-boying's politics and aesthetics, and the clarity of her linkage of graffiti, dance, and music as mutually reinforcing strategies for resistance merits quotation. Quote, "The intensity of the dancer's physicality gives breaking a power and energy even beyond the vitality of graffiti and rapping. If graffiti is a way of publishing, of winning fame by spreading your tag all over the city, breaking is a way of claiming the streets with physical presence, using your body to publicly inscribe your identity on the surfaces of the city." End quote. The b-boys built their dance vocabularies out of the long and rich traditions of African-American dance, ransacking old videos and parallel dance styles, especially New York Puerto Rican or New Yorkican styles, just as the DJs ransacked the vinyl racks. James Brown's explosive onstage dancing was a particular touchstone, as it was to the 1970s and 80s R&B stars Michael Jackson and Prince. But so also were the acrobatics of swing and mambo, the footwork of salsa and disco, the flow of 60s R&B choreographies, and the athletics of kung fu films and capoeira. Martial arts movies eventually became as strong a source of urban mythography for hip-hop groups like Wu-Tang Clan as was the Nation of Islam. Overwhelmingly, though, it was the intensified white-heat spontaneous creativity of the cipher/circle, particularly at the battles of DJs, MCs, and b-boys, everywhere from the street to Madison Square Garden, that made hip-hop dance a tsunami of bodily creativity. Even a cursory survey of the sprawling history and cultural geography of b-boying style and the interplay of its circumstances and dancers are beyond the scope of this presentation. But a larger salient point holds. B-boying, like the visual noise of graffiti writing, the sonic noise of scratching, and the textural noise of MCs on the mic, provides a way to claim, contest, and refigure urban space. Scholarship has tended to focus upon hip-hop's texts, not only raps, but also interviews, where MC's prosodic skills are unsurprisingly very effective, and also the visual text of videos, and upon its DJ's musical bricolage. While discussions of b-boying's meanings for its participants are wide and rich, only a few studies have specifically linked dancing and public space, though, as Schla says, quote, "To dance well to the chosen songs is to live in hip-hop history," end quote. Thomas DeFrance calls this, quote, "a performative oratory, a complex rhetorical vocabulary which demands and rewards readers' expertise. Sound, the sound of beats via battery-powered boomboxes, also enabled claims to public space, and made possible the demarcation of territory in what Murray Furum calls, quote, "the overlapping influences of personae and turf," end quote. Likewise, discussions of hip-hop dance have tended to focus on individual style and source influences, not so much on its role in urban geography. A happy exception to that sparsity is Ronnie Armistad's exploration of female hip-hop dances in Havana, which is solidly grounded in social theory, including Foucault, Gilroy, and Ari Murray Schafer. A second happy exception further enriches our understanding of hip-hop dance in public space, Robeson Taj Frazier and Jessica Koslow's investigation of West Coast crumpin. Though crumpin as a dance style should be distinguished from the foundations of b-boying, Frazier and Koslow describe its fraught relationship with Los Angeles' geographic, demographic, and political landscape so effectively that it also illuminates our East Coast discussion. In situating crumpin as resistance, Frazier and Koslow describe LA's, quote, "general culture of domination and regulation, where black and brown working class youth's mobility and use of public space is increasingly curtailed," end quote. In this fashion, Frazier and Koslow supply a much-needed contextualization of the spatial ecology, the physical and cognitive spaces of the session, which is the crumpin version of the cipher. Paraphrasing George Lipsitz, in order to speak specifically about dancing, Fraser and Koslow argued that dance performance can be a way for subaltern groups to, quote, "create and exercise more liberating modes of existence," end quote, and to push back against dominant constraints upon space, sound, and movement. As we have seen, dominant hierarchies' response to eruptive subaltern noise indexes its impact. Revolutionary noise in oral and visual realms pushes back against authoritarian control of space. Public noise was restricted precisely because of the middle-class anxiety it evoked, particularly when that anxiety was exacerbated by racial concerns. In the hip-hop heterolect, the line, level, boundary, and rule breaking associated with b-boying represents another cycle of bodily resistance, what Michael Hansen calls, quote, a meta-narrative of the shifting terrain of political self-consciousness and resistance, end quote. This oppositional meta-narrative is particularly essential and particularly powerful in the context of African-American embodiment, both the history of its racist exploitation and of dance's capacity for resistance. In an electronically mediated nation-state in which hegemonic cultural representations are particularly pervasive, the danced embodiment of cutting and breaking, African-American strategies of resistance that Charles Kyle has identified in music as participatory discrepancies, has political power. It's for this reason that hip-hop, like reggae before it, has become an empowering symbolic system, not only in its originating communities, but to other disenfranchised communities worldwide. Participatory dance was, is, and will continue to be an intentional, strategic, and efficacious tool employed by communities to contest dominant culture and authoritarian control of physical, sonic, and cognitive spaces. The ethnomusicologist and educator Christopher Small used the term musicking to convey the interaction of players and audience in African American concerts, and he articulated that interaction as embodying participants' own ideal, if temporary, networks of relationships. Quote, the act of musicking establishes in the place where it is happening a set of relationships, and it is in those relationships that the meaning of the act lies. They are to be found not only between those organized sounds, which are conventionally thought of as being the stuff of musical meaning, but also between the people who are taking part in whatever capacity in the performance. And they model, or they stand as metaphor for, ideal relationships as the participants in the performance imagine them to be. We might add, furthering Small's thesis, that musicking together, that is, dancing together, likewise establishes the ideal relationships that in turn collectively shape meaning. Dance was experienced in hip-hop as a literal, if temporary, revisioning of community. The capacity of movement to bring into existence the ideal society, at least for the duration of a performance, provided a fundamental means by which hip-hop artists embodied the shared physical experience of freedom. Thank you very much.